Hello, everybody. Welcome back. I'm Scott Zimmerman, business editor of George Magazine. I'm joined today by a gentleman named Jake Angeli. I had the pleasure of listening to him speak about a subject about a week ago on someone else's show, and I said to myself, we need to learn more about this. So I reached out to Jake. He was kind enough to give me permission to have an interview with him. And today we're going to learn about NLP. I'll let him tell you what that is, what it looks like, how it might be used against us, the public, but just being a tool of persuasion, maybe it could be used for good. Jake, thank you for joining me today. It's nice to see you.
Hey, it's an honor to be here. Thank you for having me.
More than welcome. So, NLP, I've heard it most of my life. Don't know exactly what it is. What does those initials stand for, and what is it?
It stands for Neuro-Linguistic Programming, which is essentially the use of linguistics or language to program the neurons in the brain or create a pattern in the brain, in particular the subconscious portion of the brain that ends up governing or affecting our conscious perception of reality.
Wow, that's a mouthful. Can you dumb it down for me since I have an IQ around room temperature?
Well, look at it like this. If you use the proper words, in particular trigger words that stimulate a instinctual response in the human mind, whether that be regarding danger or the possibility of death, or it be something regarding like the instinctual need to procreate, then the mind becomes susceptible to the information that follows regarding that vital information regarding death or reproduction.
Those are kind of base human instincts, correct? Almost a lower vibrational thought of, I need to make a child. I'm worried about dying. Why would they be pushing those sort of hot buttons? Because it's something we can't control, our basic instincts, or how do you see that?
Yeah, because these things are at the base level of our instincts and of our subconscious mind. So these portions of the brain are the most easily manipulated and hijacked. So the easiest way to do this is to use trigger words in combination with trigger images that trigger these portions of the subconscious brain and therefore affect our conscious perception of the world around us.
Can you think of a commercial or maybe a political campaign or something that we've all seen and experienced and looking back on and go, oh my gosh, they were clearly manipulating my thoughts or my emotions?
Absolutely. So a good example would be weapons of mass destruction,
Mhm.
right? That was being used all over the place after 9/11. It was being used all over the place as a means of getting us into Iraq. Now, we now know that there were, in fact, no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and this was a Mockingbird media campaign to get us into Iraq. So weapons, trigger word, mass destruction, trigger words, right? Indicating or stimulating indicating in the mind danger, stimulating the self-preservation aspects to our mental faculties.
And as you use that expression, I'm glad you picked it. What struck me was it's nebulous and it's invisible. So it's not like they said an ICBM missile, which you can picture and think, well, maybe we could intercept that. It sounds like they're using things to scare us that we can't quite wrap our mind around. Is it invisible? Is it a virus? Is it something I'm going to breathe? Is it something they can send over here? It just puts you in a state of fear, but you don't know what the enemy is. You don't know what the thing itself is.
Correct. So think about it. At that point, you've programmed the subconscious mind to perceive danger, and then the conscious mind projects whatever they think that danger might be. So at that point, the individual grafts onto the narrative their greatest fear.
Mm. You know, you're not old enough to remember this, but if any of you want to go back and watch some old Alfred Hitchcock movies, he must have mastered NLP. One of the movies that literally scared the crap out of everybody was Psycho. And if you go back and watch the movie, he never showed you the woman getting killed, ever. All you saw was a silhouette behind the curtain. And then all you saw was blood going down the drain, which actually was newspaper ink they used because it was a black and white movie. But it played out in our mind. And Hitchcock was brilliant enough to know whatever we could conjure up was going to be way scarier than anything he could ever throw up on a screen. So is that maybe an example? Is that an example of how he used the same sort of technique?
Well, it's not. Yes, it's not NLP, but it's the same sort of technique, because then the mind creates the worst possible case scenario, and then that is what people see in their cognitive grasp of what happened in that movie.
So if you were part of the industrial military complex, and you wanted to keep us going into wars and taking all the money, wouldn't you put the fear of God into us so we would back a war we otherwise would never back, or at least not fight back or protest against it?
Yes, exactly. And that's part of the strategy here, is to use our own instincts against us. And in many ways, to use the emotional response generated by this propaganda to go after the enemies of the military industrial complex or the deep state, whether that be an individual or a group of individuals or a other nation.
So I just did a couple shows with Richard Gage, who's an absolute architectural whiz, and he spent his whole life digging into the fallacy of how we were sold. Those 3 skyscrapers came down on 9/11. And when I look back on it, I have several thoughts of mental manipulation. You let me know if this is right in line with what you were saying, but you had to literally shock the consciousness of Americans to start the process of reprogramming us to where as the victims of that event were not only the poor souls in the building and the poor people who went back to try to clean it up, who are now dying because of what they ingested, but it also is now impacting generations of Americans, because I believe that was the day that parents started raising their children in fear and not in freedom. And that's when they kept them closer to the house. That's where they wanted to monitor where they were all the time. Because when I was a kid, it was free range chicken. As long as I was in before the lights were on, the street lights were on, they didn't care where I was, and there was no real fear. That said, I clearly remember being raised during the time of Cold War with Russia. And I'll remember playing as a child, and I would look over at the sunset with this fear that someday there's going to be 2 suns setting. And the second one's going to be a mushroom cloud. And I thought about that all the time as a child, when I should have been thinking about playing ball or doing something like that. But I actually thought about how they programmed us in kindergarten. We would sit in the hallways with our heads down between our legs. That's how you survive a nuclear blast. Basically, they were teaching us to kiss our butt goodbye is what they were teaching us. But so yes. if you look at 9/11, and then here comes the Patriot Act right on its heels, mere months, and that should have taken years to write. But some miracle, here it comes. So now we've seen the trauma of 3,000 souls disappearing like that. And now it's the perfect timing to start working on our minds. We know who did it. Let's go get them. Weapons of mass destruction. Let's go in that one too. And it plays out over and over. And the media would not let go. Replay after replay after replay of those towers coming down. So they burn it into our psyche. Is that what this sort of programming looks like?
Yes, when it's weaponized. So let's talk for a second about what you're talking about, the Cold War. So imagine for a moment that you have a classroom full of young, eager, absorbing minds, and then you play a video of what a nuclear blast does to a house or to a car or whatever, right? And then what you do is you tell these children that this could happen at any time, that this is a possibly imminent future that we can't control, right? Then you say, okay, now what we're all going to do is we're going to get under our desk, or we're going to go in the hallway, and we're going to, tuck beneath the desk or put our head between our legs to shield ourselves from this blast that clearly there is no shielding yourself from. And in some cases, you even have the sound of the sirens going off in the background, right? All of these things are a programming of the mind that imminent death could come at any moment.
Right.
And the only way that you can avoid this is if you support the military industrial complex and its campaigns, right? Now, let's graft that idea, because that is a form of neuro-linguistic programming, okay? Let's graft that idea of trigger words and trigger images and how they were used during the Soviet Union and the Cold War era, and graft that onto, for example, what happened in the Middle East and with 9/11, okay? What did we have in 9/11? We had the terms terrorism or terrorist, terror being the key, word. We had Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, 9/11. And those things were repeated over and over and over and over again and pushed into the psyche of the populations, right? And in combination with these words, you have, like you said, the towers, disintegrating. You have the Pentagon and the smoke, etc. So then there's also like all the Hollywood movies that came out afterward. So now what we have is the same trigger words, trigger images, only a new foreign enemy to go after. You see, and the same idea of at any point this could happen again. And you and your families are not safe unless you pass the Patriot Act. Now think about this in neuro-linguistic programming. After what happened on 9/11, there was a mass unification in the country. Republican and Democrat voters, it didn't matter. We were all against Al-Qaeda and the terrorists and stopping something like this horrible thing from happening ever again. And then so they come to the American population with the Patriot Act. What a lovely title. Who's going to be against the Patriot Act?
Right.
You see? So they gave it this wonderful title. And in the Patriot Act, it was probably one of the least patriotic laws and acts that has ever been passed in the United States. It's the antithesis of the constitutional republic that our founders, created. So they put pleasant titles on things that they want people to get behind. And a lot of the time they use that as the tool to quell the fear that they generated in the Mockingbird media. So it's problem, reaction, solution. The problem is created by a small group. The public reacts, and then the small group that created the problem hands the public the solution. And usually the solution is the centralization of power and authority.
And and I think it was Ben Franklin who said anyone who gives up their freedoms for safety and security deserves exactly what they're going to get.
Yeah, deserves neither.
Yeah, that was it. Yes.
Yeah, deserves and gets neither, I think was the quote.
Yes, thank you. That's why I always interview people smarter than me, and they're really easy to find. So, and if you think about how this programming affects children, I'm an example. So I lived my entire childhood afraid that the Russians were going to nuke my family. And I was only not even halfway through my senior year. And I walked by that recruiter's table and I said, can I sign up early? And they ran the tests. And I was already pre-enlisted to go into Army intelligence because I wanted to fix the electronics to spy on those bastards. Well, it turns out maybe we were the bastards. So I gave up 4 years of my life playing a very serious game, thinking I was protecting my family and my country against this giant red threat, which more than likely was probably our own government. And in hindsight, but there's a form of manipulation to give somebody, I should have been going to college and instead I'm in the military. And I was the only one in my family who made that choice because I probably made it out of fear, but a sense of patriotism, like I was doing something, but it was probably predicated on fear.
Yes. Well, here's the thing about all that, though, is that the military industrial complex needs human bodies, needs people to act as gears in the machine. So when we are given a massive propaganda campaign, there will be a reaction to it on behalf of the public. This is where we get into the mass hypnosis or the mass propagandization of the public, basically the mass neuro-linguistic programming of the public. So neuro-linguistic programming is the use of linguistics to program the neurons in the subconscious portion of the brain so that it affects a person's conscious perception of reality. They use trigger words and trigger images to create an emotional or instinctual response in the subconscious mind, and then they weaponize that emotional response as a means of targeting individuals, groups, or other nations. Now, critical factor bypass. Critical factor bypass is the mass neuro-linguistic programming of the public. And how this is done, and the reason why it's called critical factor bypass is because the critical thinking factors in the conscious mind are bypassed and the subconscious brain is programmed. And this is done by saturating all the media outlets with the same exact message and repeating it over and over and over and over again. So magazines, newspapers, radio, television, in this case nowadays, social media, the internet, etc. All of these portions of the environment are saturated with this message, and it is repeated over and over and over again so that the subconscious mind thinks that it must be true because it's everywhere. And then there is a certain portion of the population that believes the propaganda, that becomes programmed, and then reacts to this external stimuli. And so from neuro-linguistic programming, which is the individual mind, and critical factor bypass, which is the collective mind, you get something called mass formation hypnosis, where massive amounts of the population, 25 to 30% of the population, believe the propaganda. They react in the way that was intended when they created the propaganda, and then they are weaponized against the enemies of the people that created the propaganda. And we saw what mass formation hypnosis can do in Nazi Germany. We saw what it can do with the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. We saw what it can do like with the Red Army Revolution in China. And they are attempting to do something very, very similar now. Now, what's really interesting about all this is, are you familiar with Yuri Bezmenov?
I am not. Please educate me.
So Yuri Bezmenov is an ex-KGB operative. He was in charge of psychological warfare for the Soviet Union. He ended up defecting to the United States in the 80s, and then he gave an interview or several interviews regarding what the Russians called ideological subversion or psychological warfare campaigns, and how it was a long game, how they were basically going to destroy the United States from within. Okay. Now, he said that it's a four-part strategy. Number one is demoralization. This is where we get into neuro-linguistic programming. So in demoralization, what happens is that the Soviets or the communists, and by the way, Yuri Bezmenov did say that there is a global communist conspiracy, and he would know, he was KGB. He said that the communists were going to infiltrate the United States of America. Their education institutions, in particular colleges and K through 12 schools, their entertainment, okay, Hollywood, their media, okay, news organizations, etc., and their governments and politics in particular. And once those institutions had been infiltrated, they were going to disseminate demoralizing propaganda into all of these institutions that neuro-linguistically programmed the individual from childhood all the way to adulthood to essentially hate their own country, to believe that the United States was evil and had to be destroyed, and that a communist government must be installed. And Yuri said that this is going to take about anywhere from 15 to 20 years, because what it's about is demoralizing a whole generation of American youth, right? So this is neuro-linguistic programming. This is why we see so much anti-American propaganda out there in Hollywood or in the media or it's in colleges, why there's so many communist professors in colleges, why conservatives and constitutionalists are being censored so heavily, either in the media, on social media, in colleges, etc. Now, that being said, the next phase is destabilization.
Well,
So
wait,
what
wait, wait.
happens
Excuse
is
me, Jake. Jake, before you get into destabilization, for anybody listening, if you don't think this doesn't work, we watched it work with everybody getting vaccinated. And some of the most intelligent, educated people in my life, I'll never forget this. This is when I realized my loved ones are brainwashed. I had 5 conversations in 2 weeks, and this is about a month or two after the vax is rolled out. In all 5 conversations, I'd never mentioned anything about COVID, the pandemic, nothing. All 5 of them interrupted and said, "Oh, by the way, did you get your shot yet?" They were proud that they had an experimental drug put into their body. And I just deflected it and changed subjects because I don't want to, insult anybody. But I said to my wife, I said, "I've known these people my whole life. They sound like a zombie." And then when you go back and every other commercial was Pfizer or Moderna. Then I watched them use the stick of fear and the carrot of a free donut or whatever it is. And it was in every newspaper article. It was on the radio. It was all over social media. And that's when I began to realize that the government, pharma, big tech, they were all working together to depopulate the planet, to get us brainwashed to where we thanked them as they were going to kill us. It was just
well, and
so
that's evidence of its critical factor bypass.
right. And I watched it play out. So we don't have to go all the way back to Hitler. I mean, this happened a couple of years ago. And the reason I wanted to do this interview with you is I want people to play this for their loved ones who bragged about getting the vax and say, at least you can look in hindsight and see how they did it so that this can never happen to us again. We've got to pick up the patterns earlier. When somebody big is pushing something so hard and so often, you better take a good look at it and either unplug from it or weaponize it back against them and wake everybody up around you. And the only guy I've seen fighting back using the same tool, Donald Trump. There's a reason he keeps going fake news, fake news, fake news, fake news, fake news. He's burning it into our consciousness, which I'm sure is working its way back into our subconscious mind. He's begging us never trust them ever again. And then he did it by coming up with, Crooked Hillary, Sleepy Joe. Everybody's got a nickname because it sticks. So anyways, carry on to your next phase. I just wanted people to know this isn't an old-fashioned thing that we've gone long past. We're living in it right now.
We are. And it's because these techniques are effective.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what's interesting about what Yuri Bezmenov said about demoralization, though, is that he said that you can bring black and white information. You can bring the documents, the dossiers, you can bring them pictures of how communism is evil, how they have concentration camps, the massive amounts of famine. You can show anyone and everyone the truth in black and white, and these demoralized people will not believe it. He said it himself. They've become so heavily demoralized or so heavily neuro-linguistically programmed with demoralizing propaganda that they will not believe the truth. And this is because it causes something in them called cognitive dissonance. Okay. And that is such a profound level of discomfort when new information is absorbed that contradicts all of the other information that they've based their lives on, that they would rather reject the message and the messenger than absorb the message and reevaluate their view of reality. So with that being said, the next phase, you have demoralization, which we just delineated. Then you have destabilization. And destabilization is what happens when you have the infiltrators within all these institutions, along with the demoralized generation, going and destabilizing their economy, destabilizing their social values, destabilizing their country, right? And that takes a couple of years. And from the destabilization, you get the third phase, which is crisis. So the destabilization ends up creating a lot of crisis, whether it be the collapsing of a housing market or banking institutions failing, whether it be a supply chain collapse, whether it be riots in the streets, et cetera, et cetera.
So 2020 rioting and tearing down our statues and trying to erase our history, that's your destabilization. We're now living through the crises of the open borders, the fentanyl killing our youth, the supply chain issues crushing business and our economy, artificially inflated gas prices and inflation, the rapidly rising mortgage rates. As long as we can stand back and learn what you're teaching and look at it, at least now we can begin either choosing to not accept it or maybe pushing back en masse and letting them know we're on to you. We know exactly what you're doing, how you're doing it, and why you're doing it, and we choose to not comply. Take it somewhere else.
Right. Well, and we'll explain how it is that these techniques can be used for good in just a moment.
Good.
But the final phase, so you have demoralization, destabilization, crisis, and then after the crisis, what ends up happening is that the communist infiltrators within the system place themselves at the highest levels of power. And then from that point on, they begin to normalize their being in power, normalize a communist slave state, normalize the demoralized perspective of reality, normalize destabilization, normalize crisis. And it reminds me of this video of John Kerry talking about how, we can deal with the crises at home, we can deal with the crisis in Europe and the energy crisis in Europe, we can deal with the crisis in Ukraine, and we can deal with the climate crisis all at the same time. And my thinking is, hold on a second. You have been in power for like literally decades, and you created all of these crises. It's your being in power that created all these things. So how in the hell is it that you're supposed to fix all these crises you created over the past several decades in the matter of a couple of months to a year? It's ludicrous. He is a part of the swamp, or he is a part of these infiltrators that infiltrated the government. You see, John Kerry came back and was demoralizing the people in Vietnam after he came back from Vietnam, you see. So they place people in power that are for this communist agenda. Another good example would be John McCain, who sold out and gave American secrets to the Vietnamese, to the Viet Cong. So these are the people that get placed in power. Now, to quote JFK, infiltration instead of invasion, subversions instead of elections, right? So that's what we saw in pretty much every election for a long time, but especially in 2020. Intimidation instead of free choice. We see that with cancel culture. Guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. We saw that with the riots in 2020. You see? So the point here is that we are dealing with, to quote JFK, a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, scientific, economic, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No rumor is printed, no expenditure is questioned, and no secret is revealed. Okay? So we've been dealing with this for a very long time. And it's because there have been infiltrators within our government for decades. And as more and more get in high levels of power, especially within the bureaucracy, because they can stay in power far longer than elected officials, from the top down of these bureaucratic pyramids, they end up being able to corrupt lower portions within the pyramid, and they can corrupt and control the people in the lower portion that are just like the civil servants trying to do the right thing. And the only people that advance are the people that are for this New World Order, communist, global agenda.
I'm going to circle back. I hate to use that term, but I just want to go back and touch upon two things from your earlier phases of this. I accidentally caught them doing this to us at George Magazine, and I was proofing an article. And when they just described someone as a Black person, the B was capitalized. And then later in the article, they said happens to be a white person. The W was capitalized. And I turned it in. I said, these are not a proper use of the capitalization. You would only capitalize someone by name if it was like a job title, the CEO of, the marketing manager, Scott Zimmerman. And I'm like, why are we capitalizing the word black and white? And it just struck me because we're trying to create that divide in people's mind that this person is identified now by the color of their skin, not what they're doing or what they believe in or anything. That is now how this person's going to be identified, as white with a capital W, just to burn that into our subconscious mind. That has to be some sort of NLP, is it not?
Yes, yes, it is. So identity politics, racial identity, sexual identity, all of these things are done to divide the people into compartmentalized and propagandized groups of their own choosing. Okay, so let's talk for a second about Operation Mockingbird. So the CIA infiltrated the major media outlets in the United States during an operation called Operation Mockingbird in the 1960s and 70s. They did this to control the narrative regarding the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement. Now, ever since then, I mean, it's only gotten stronger. And so what the Mockingbird media does is it divides people into these compartmentalized groups of warring tribes based on different racial ideologies or identities, different sexual identities and ideologies, different political ideologies and identities. And then everybody's fighting one another over the neuro-linguistically programmed talking points that they were handed by the Mockingbird media. And these propaganda campaigns are intentionally divisive through the use of trigger words and trigger images. So, for example, you have Fox News and Newsmax on one side, the right, the Republican. Then you have MSNBC and CNN on the other, the left, the liberal Democrats. And each of these institutions is giving people the information that they want to hear that confirms their confirmation bias, while at the same time causes them to hate the opposition to their particular ideology. Now, I'm of the belief that we could all agree on far more than we disagree on. But because of the nature of the propaganda campaigns, how it involves things like neuro-linguistic programming, trigger words and trigger images to program the subconscious portion of the brain, how it involves things like critical factor bypass, the saturation of all media outlets with a very specific message, how that affirms certain people's confirmation bias. All of those things create a mass formation where you have 25 to 30% of the country believing one thing, 25 to 30% of the country believing another regarding a situation or a controversy that is generated and spotlighted by the Mockingbird media. And then there's these dueling factions of looking at the same stimuli from different perspectives. I like to point out I like to illustrate this by explaining, if you were to hang a cylinder from a ceiling, right, on a string, and then on one side of the cylinder, you shine a flashlight at the cylinder, and on the wall, you would have a rectangle.
Mm-hmm.
On the other side, if you shine it, you have a circle. And then now what we have people saying, oh, the truth is a rectangle. No, the truth is a circle. When in fact, it's neither a circle nor a rectangle. It is a cylinder. Do you see what I'm saying?
No, that is
And
a
that's
great
what the Mockingbird
illustration.
media does. Yeah,
Yes,
that's what they do.
and I've seen it work in my own life. And then I'll give an example of cognitive dissonance as well. But in my life, I used to have we had Fun Day Mondays, and like 5 other couples would always come to my house on Mondays, and we'd fire up the barbecue and have a couple adult beverages and make each other rip, snort, laughing, telling jokes, and getting along famously. And these people loved me and my wife. And it's been 7 years since we've seen any of them, and I haven't changed. I'm the same fun-loving, decent guy I was back then. The only thing that changed was I began supporting Donald Trump. And these same people it isn't so much that they can hate Trump. I mean, the media burned that into their minds. I get that. But how did I get thrown under the bus too, just because I voted for a guy? Now they burned it so deeply into these people's minds that not only is Trump bad, but his supporters are even worse. And I just want to sit down with them and say, you guys want to come over on a Monday night? You'd be surprised. I'm still the same guy you used to love. And now you won't even talk to me. What did I do? I voted. Last I heard, that was my right as an American. So it's very real and it's very sad. And so part of what I'm doing with George Magazine and these shows is I'm trying to wake some people up in a way that isn't a bucket of cold water in their face. That doesn't work. I need them to get some level of education to make the hardest admission there is to make. Wasn't it Mark Twain who said it's easier to fool somebody than to get them to admit that they've been fooled?
Yeah, it's easier to fool people than convince them they've been fooled. That was Mark Twain.
We're living through that right now. And that this will be the great awakening of us not judging someone and not saying, I told you so, because they are going to start waking up. And what they're going to wake up to, this ties into cognitive dissonance. They're going to wake up to not only were they lied to about 9/11 or Vietnam or any of those things, they were lied to about everything that their entire belief and value systems were built upon. Now, when that happens, your subconscious mind goes batshit crazy because it doesn't want to let that information in, because our subconscious mind exists for one reason: to survive anything, including us. And the minute it is shown something like Building 7 coming down in its own footprint in free fall, somebody I respect more than anybody else in this world in my life was an industrial engineer and absolutely refused to believe that thing came down, or he just believed it was an office fire. He refused to believe something nefarious was at play. Didn't want to talk to me for a couple of years and refused, and even sent me a book written by Popular Mechanics, which didn't even mention Building 7, and then the official NIST report. And finally, he wouldn't wake up to it, but he did admit, he goes, I hate to admit it, but almost all of our friends agree with you and your wife. I go, well, that's a start. And so as people are starting to wake up, we cannot say, I told you so, or what took you so long, because you have to understand the subconscious mind is 1,000 times more powerful than our conscious mind. And when they start allowing that to seep into their conscious thinking, it is going to cause a lot of pain for them. I mean, a lot. When I red pilled myself on 9/11 alone, it took me months to rebuild my operating system. I'm talking months. I was miserable. It was because I had to rebuild everything. And by the way, never do a show when you have a 6-month-old kitten who's only 2 days away from getting tutored. Might calm them down a little bit. So, anyways, that didn't mean to derail it, but I really want to get across to people that what your loved ones are now starting, they're rubbing their eyes, they're waking up a little bit. It's going to be very, very painful for them. And all we can do is love on them with the patience of Jesus, answer their questions, give them hugs. And this is what the deep state is fearing most. When I look at another person, I don't see black, I see love. I don't see a Democrat, I see love. And look at what they've done. Everything was separatism, always black and white, left and right, Ohio State and Michigan. There's a million ways to divide us, rich and poor. No more. We're all one. We're all energy. We're all the same. No one's above another. We're all energy and connected from our hearts with love. When we get there, it's over. It's done. They won't be able to exist.
And that's why, that's why the propaganda campaigns are so intense and divisive. That's why they're based on fear, because fear is a weapon. And those who control that fear control the mind of the person that is placed under the influence of that fear.
From what I understand, go ahead.
And you're right when you say that when these people are waking up, the last thing that you want to be is the guy that said, I told you so. I told you so. Where have you been? What you want to do is be like, man, I know how you feel. I went through it. And I'm just, if you need anything, I got you. Just let me know. I will be there for you. I feel what you're feeling, man. And it's hard. I know. And so empathy, sympathy,
Yes.
a real connection is what these people are looking for. Because when you have a cognitive dissonance and you really begin to absorb this information, you feel very isolated. A lot of the reason why people don't want to go through that is because it's a form of ego death. Their old identity is being destroyed, and they have to formulate a new one based on a new cognitive grasp of reality. And that is very painful. The same portions of the brain that process physical pain also process mental and emotional pain. So if these things are mentally and emotionally painful, it is akin to being in great physical pain for people. That's why they avoid it.
Yes. And you triggered another a thought. Being a sales trainer, I've read a lot of books on the psychology of influence and laws of persuasion. And as I began teaching these, often people would say, well, Scott, isn't that manipulative? Let's say one of the laws is commitment and consistency. So if I can get you to agree with me that you thought that the JFK shooting was a little fishy, that one guy pulled that off using a crappy carbine from a window and a moving target and got 3 shots off in 7 seconds, you go, I always thought that was fishy. Well, now we can agree on something. So now when I am able to tie that to something similar, you've already agreed that that's fishy. Now it's difficult for you to say, well, no, that must be true. And because now you're already agreeing that there might be another fishiness here too. And people would say, well, you teach that. Isn't that manipulative? I go, no, it's just a tool. And I said, a hammer is a tool. I could pick it up and smack you in the temple and kill you, or I could go help fix your grandmother's house. So isn't NLP a tool that we should understand so that, number one, we can shield ourselves from its effect? But how could we maybe use something like this, maybe with our loved ones or maybe even en masse? How can we use NLP for the good?
Okay, that's a great question. I'm really glad you asked it. So when we talk about NLP, what we're talking about is syntax, or the use of words to describe the world to ourselves, to cognize reality. Okay, to tell ourselves a story about who we are, where we are, what it means, what we're doing, why we're doing it, etc. Now, the aspects of NLP which have been weaponized can be used for good. Like you're saying, helping people to see a larger pattern is part of it. Now, this is why what I like to do is I like to bring up neutral concepts that most people are not triggered when they hear about. For example, most people, as ironic as it is, don't know who Nikola Tesla is, and they don't know that he invented a tower, what I call a Tesla tower. He invented a tower that was built on electromagnetic ley lines that could give everybody infinite, free, clean, wireless electricity. And he did this in the early 1900s. So, for example, if you have an environmentalist friend,
Mm-hmm.
and they're talking about carbon emissions and the dangers of oil and all that stuff, which the truth of the matter is petroleum is highly damaging to the environment. It is toxic. Okay. It's meant to be under the soil for a reason. It's not meant to be in the air. It's not meant to be housing our water. You know what I mean? So you can say, look, I agree that oil is toxic, but have you heard about Nikola Tesla and his Tesla towers and infinite free clean wireless electricity? And a lot of them will say, well, no, what is that? And then you begin to start on neutral cognitive ground. You are starting in a place of their subconscious mind that has not yet been programmed, has not yet been given these like mental landmines, these triggers that if you step on, they will trigger a cognitive dissonance. So then you say, yeah, man, like this guy Nikola Tesla in the early 1900s, I mean, he gave us X-rays, he gave us infrared, he gave us night vision goggles, he gave us radio, he gave us alternating current, he gave us you name it. Like he's the father and the grandfather of the 20th and the 21st century. So he came up with this invention in the early 1900s that could give everybody infinite free clean wireless electricity by using the electromagnetic field of the earth. And it was all suppressed by the big bankers at the time that wanted to meter our electricity and make money off of it, as opposed to giving everybody a certain level of independence. So notice what you've done there is you've factored in the word free, clean. You've also factored in the word big bankers. You've also factored in the words metering electricity, or you could even throw the word monopolize in there. And you've also thrown in the word independence. So these are words that create positive or negative emotional responses that are already in these people's minds. And so think about it like this. Imagine if the entire environmentalist movement, instead of trusting the very corporations that are destroying the environment and trying to monopolize our resources and labor in the process, instead of trusting them, imagine if these people knew about and were asking for Tesla Tower technology. That right there would solve so many problems. And it would create a decentralized energy grid. It would create a decentralized communication grid, because you can use these towers to communicate. It could neutralize pollution and get rid of pollution. It could be used for agriculture. Okay, there's so many different applications for it, all of which move us away from dependence on the globalist less than 1%ers full spectrum dominant system, and toward a decentralized independent system where we, the people, have the power and are not dependent on them. So another example, everybody, Republican and Democrat voters alike, have likely known someone who has lost someone or has lost somebody to cancer. Okay. Now, if you introduce the idea that in the 1930s, there was a man named Royal Raymond Rife, that Dr. Rife created a machine while he was working with Tesla, created a machine that used frequency and vibration, not just to improve human health, but to also destroy and kill disease. And that this invention was suppressed by the very people that tried to suppress and destroy Tesla's towers and his invention. Then you get into another level of neutral ground, because then they begin to think to themselves, well, I had a friend or I had a loved one that I lost to cancer. Are you telling me that the cure has been out there and has been suppressed from the people by the FDA and the government and big pharma? Yes, that's what happened. So this is neutral ground that most people are not used to talking about. And it's a way of moving away from the programmed conversations that these people have been handed by the Mockingbird media, and introducing novel, original concepts for which there is plenty of research and corroborating evidence that they then can do. They can do this research. And what's really interesting, and this will be the final point that I make regarding this topic, is that when people do their own research, they go into the process of reprogramming their own subconscious. They go through the voluntary process of deprogramming their minds and neuro-linguistically programming their minds toward truth. So one of the easiest ways to do this is asking them questions. Have you heard of Nikola Tesla and his Tesla Tower's infinite free clean wireless energy?
I'm doing an entire show on the Socratic method of helping people wake themselves up. Because when you were talking about Tesla, you can't have a logical argument with someone and present them with facts and evidence. That's not going to do any good. It's going to be an emotional reaction to something. And so if I were to ask somebody, what do you know about Nikola Tesla? And they say, not much. I've heard the name. And maybe we bring up these energy towers and they go, oh, yeah. Or they go, wait a minute, there's free energy that was invented 120 years ago. And I go, I know. It shocked me. And I go, who do you think would have the means and the motive to want to hide something that wonderful for mankind from mankind? I want to get them to say what I wanted to tell them. because I'm telling you, if I can get you to say it, you'll own it. If it comes from me, you'll subconsciously push back, even though you probably know I'm right. So I'm just going to ask questions, and then maybe we can go study it together. And I can't wait. I'm doing that show this week because it's so important to let them be the expert and let them feel good about learning new things, because now we've got the momentum going. Then when they teach it back to me, it goes even deeper into their mind, because now it's their belief, not mine. Now we're on to something. So you just baked
Yes.
that perfect cupcake of finding the neutral thing. And I just wanted to drop a little cherry on it, which is, I know I can tell you all about Tesla, but I want you to tell me about Tesla.
Yes, precisely. You're absolutely 100% correct. Now, the funny thing is that when people research Tesla or Dr. Reif, what they're going to find are three things. Number one, corruption at its inception here in the United States, how certain families have monopolized our currency, our resources, our labor, and how they have actively suppressed any move toward independence, any move away from their monopolies, which will infuriate Republicans and Democrats alike.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a lot easier to believe that this happened, 100 years ago, 120 years ago, and then see how it has continued until now, than to convince people that it's all this big, massive conspiracy that was just somehow popped out of thin air. Okay. The next thing that they're going to find when they research Tesla and Rife is they're going to find all of the applications for these technologies, how it is that they can free us, the people, how it is that they can create independence, how they can get us away from this centralized control grid and the monopolies of less than 1% of the population. And then the last thing, and this is very important, Nikola Tesla said, if you want to understand the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. Now, in order to understand how Dr. Reif's machine works and how it is that if you can destroy a wine glass with sound and frequency, you can also destroy cancer cells or viruses with sound and frequency. In order to understand how infinite free clean wireless energy is able to be tapped in the earth itself through the ley lines, you have to understand energy, frequency, and vibration, which means that as people look into these technologies and understand how they work, and it is actually really simple, then the secrets of the universe begin to unfold before them. So when they begin to reprogram themselves as they do their own research and come back to you and say, wow, this is what I found, what they're going to find, what they're going to do is they're going to reprogram their minds with understanding the corruption in the United States, understanding our level of technological innovation and where we could be if we use these technologies. And number three, they're going to understand the secrets of the universe. So we have a cultural awakening regarding the corrupt nature to our civilization. We also have a technological awakening and ascension in the sense of using this technology for liberation of humanity. And we also have a spiritual ascension and evolution, an evolution in consciousness. And this, coming back to neuro-linguistic programming, this is the war for the mind. This is a war of consciousness. This is a crisis of consciousness because of the education systems being infiltrated, because of Hollywood being infiltrated, because of the politicians, et cetera, et cetera. We are not being given real information. If people think fake news is something, wait until they get a load of fake history and fake science. And yes, those things are real, because there are things that have deliberately been suppressed so that these monopolies and this parasitic culture can grow.
Wow, I can't think of a better way to wrap this up, but I'll do what I always like to do, is my way of thanking brilliant people like you who give me the gift of your time and knowledge. Is there anything you'd like to wrap up with that's top of mind or near and dear to your heart?
Yes. Love equals unity, and peace and freedom are the prize. We are not going to be able to use violence to get ourselves out of the mess that we are in. Nonviolent non-cooperation with evil is the only means to defeating it. If you look at what happened in Romania with the nonviolent overthrow of communism regarding the protecting of a pastor who the communists wanted to kill, the communist dictator wanted to kill, and how they did a candlelight vigil where the people of Romania actually stood in the gap and in front of the military, in front of the police, and said, no, you're not going to kill this pastor, and how that actually ended up causing the fall of communism in Romania, then you will begin to grasp the importance and the power behind nonviolent non-cooperation. If you look at history, whether it be in Romania, I believe it was in 2011, or it be the civil rights movement in the 60s, right? Or it be Gandhi in India, or it be even Jesus Christ in Jerusalem and in Israel, and how it is that he was basically proposing, like, don't cooperate. You don't have to feed into their evil. You know what I'm saying? Turn the other cheek, basically.
I saw a perfect example of this. One of the few video clips that are actually out from the fake January 6th thing were being sold. And I saw somebody just give love. And when it was so unexpected, I saw somebody who had broken in, walked into the Capitol building, and he's wearing this face paint and this hat with the horns. And these police officers were about to arrest that individual. And you know what he did? He just stopped. He says, "Can I please pray for you people?" And right in the middle of chaos, he just stopped and gave a prayer for the very people who were about to arrest him. You know what? They allowed him to do it. And I said to myself, if I could ever meet that guy someday, it'd be one of the best days of my life. And today I got to meet that guy. Jake, thank you so much for spending your time with me today. I just wanted people to see a side of you that isn't being painted what the media had painted you as, being some crazy person. You are on the opposite end of that. So any of you who've watched it to the end, now that you know who this man really is and what he did on January 6th, then you'll begin to understand how the media will spin anything to try to keep people like him suppressed, feared, and keep us ignorant about seeing the inside good in everyone else. So thank you very much. This has been a true pleasure for me and an honor. And Jake, I wish you nothing but good things and God's blessings moving forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. God bless. Namaste.
All right. Take care.